Last Christmas, I rented a remote cabin in northern Minnesota to get away from the chaos of the holidays. I thought a quiet week surrounded by snowy pines and frozen lakes would be exactly what I needed to reset. The cabin was cozy, with a fireplace, big windows, and a deck that overlooked a small frozen lake. I was the only one out there for miles, or at least I thought I was. The first 2 days were perfect. I hiked through the snow-covered woods during the day and curled up by the fire at night. It was idyllic, almost too good to be true. On the third day, though, things started to feel off. I woke up to find footprints in the snow on the lake. They started near the shore and went straight across the ice to the middle, then stopped. There were no prints leading back, no sign of where the person had come from. It didn't make sense. I stood on the deck, staring at the lake, trying to figure out how someone could walk out there and just vanish. The ice was thick enough to support weight, so I wasn't worried about someone falling through, but the whole thing gave me a weird feeling. I told myself it was probably just a hiker who had walked across the lake and left by a different route. But the next morning, there were more footprints. This time they started at the shore closest to the cabin and went out to the same spot in the middle of the lake. Again, no prints leading back. It was unsettling, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was some local tradition or something. I didn't know much about the area, and I wasn't in the mood to scare myself over nothing. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound outside. It was faint, almost like a soft, crunching noise, the kind boots make when they walk through snow. I got up and peeked out the window, but I didn't see anything. The moonlight lit up the lake, and everything looked still. In the morning, I checked again. More footprints. This time, they led from the lake up to the edge of the deck. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard anyone knock or try to get in, but someone had been close to the cabin. Too close. I grabbed a flashlight and looked around the deck for any other signs of activity, but didn't find anything. No dropped items, no scratches on the door, nothing. Just the footprints in the snow. I decided to call the rental agency to report it, but the phone reception out there was spotty at best. I managed to leave a voicemail explaining what had happened, but I didn't hear back. That night the sound came back. This time it was louder and closer, like someone was walking right outside the cabin. I stayed in bed, heart racing, clutching a heavy flashlight in case I needed to defend myself. In the morning I saw the footprints again. They circled the cabin, stopping by each window before leading back down to the lake. I decided that was it. I was done. I packed up my things and planned to leave as soon as the sun came up. But as I loaded my car, I glanced back at the lake one last time and froze. Standing in the middle of the ice was a figure, tall and motionless, staring straight at me. I couldn't make out any features because they were bundled up in a thick coat and scarf, but I knew they were watching me. I didn't stick around to find out who they were or what they wanted. I jumped in the car and drove as fast as I could down the icy road, not stopping until I was back in town. Later, when I returned the cabin keys to the rental agency, the woman at the desk looked confused when I told her what had happened. She said no one should have been out there, it was private property, and the lake was surrounded by woods. I don't know who or what I saw out there, but I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. Now, whenever I see snow-covered footprints, I can't help but think back to that figure on the lake, silently watching me. Last December, I was driving up to my parents' house in Vermont for the holidays. It was one of those postcard perfect scenes, snow blanketing the ground, pine trees lining the road, and the occasional cabin puffing smoke from its chimney. My parents live way off the beaten path, so the roads get emptier the farther north you go. I usually love the peace and quiet, but this time it made things a little too eerie. It was around 7 p.m., but the winter darkness made it feel like the middle of the night. I had about 30 miles to go when I noticed a pair of headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cars are rare on that stretch of road, but it's not impossible to see one. The thing is, the car stayed behind me. Not close enough to tailgate, but just far enough to be noticeable in the rear view mirror. Every time the road curved or split, they followed. I told myself it was just a coincidence. They were probably headed to the same small town or one of the cabins along the way. After about 15 minutes, I started feeling uneasy. It didn't make sense for someone to stick so close on these kinds of roads unless they were in a rush and this driver wasn't trying to pass me. When I slowed down to take a curve, they slowed down too. I figured I'd shake them off by pulling over at a gas station. There was a little one about 5 miles ahead, and I could use a break anyway. When I got there, I parked by the pump and went inside to grab a coffee. The car passed by without stopping, and I felt a wave of relief. I stayed inside for a few minutes, hoping to give them a head start. Once I was sure they were gone, I got back in my car and continued driving. The next 20 minutes were uneventful, and I started to relax again. That's when I saw the headlights return. I don't know how they did it, but they must have turned around and waited somewhere, because there they were, following me again. My pulse started racing. It was too late to turn back, and there weren't many places to pull over. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but they matched my pace. When I slowed down, they did too. It was like they were playing a game and I was the target. There was one stretch of road I knew well, a sharp downhill slope followed by a one-lane bridge. I decided I'd try to lose them there. As I approached the slope, I pushed the gas pedal hard, flying down the hill faster than I should have. My tires skidded slightly on the icy road, but I managed to keep control. When I looked in the rear view mirror, the headlights were gone. I thought maybe they'd given up or lost their nerve on the slick road. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and kept driving, slower this time. I didn't see the car again until I turned onto the final stretch of road leading to my parents' house. Their house is at the end of a long driveway surrounded by woods. As I turned in, I caught a glimpse of headlights far behind me. They didn't follow me onto the driveway, but they stopped at the entrance, just sitting there. I parked the car and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. My parents were already asleep, so I didn't wake them. Instead, I peered out the front window, trying to see if the car was still there. It was gone. I told myself it was over, that whoever it was had finally given up and left. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft crunching sound outside. It was faint, like someone walking in the snow. I peeked through the curtains and saw nothing but darkness. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there watching the house. The next morning, I checked the driveway. There were tire tracks leading up to the entrance and footprints in the snow near the edge of the woods. They didn't go toward the house, but they were close enough to make my skin crawl. I never found out who was driving that car or why they were following me. But to this day, I avoid driving alone at night during the holidays. Something about the combination of snow and silence makes it too easy for shadows to creep closer, for strangers to blend into the cold, white landscape. Last year, I decided to rent a secluded cabin in the mountains for the holidays. My work had been hectic, and I wanted nothing more than to escape the noise of the city and spend Christmas surrounded by snow-covered trees and quiet. I booked a week-long stay through a rental site, packed up my car, and made the 6-hour drive into the wilderness. The cabin was exactly what I'd hoped for. It was small but cozy, with a wood-burning stove, a wraparound porch, and a view of a frozen lake just beyond the tree line. There wasn't another soul for miles, which felt perfect at first. The first couple of days were bliss. I spent my time reading by the fire, hiking along snowy trails, and sipping hot cocoa while watching the sun dip behind the mountains. It felt like the world had paused just for me. But on the third night, things started to feel off. It began with a sound, faint but distinct. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something outside. At first I thought it was just the wind brushing against the cabin, but then it became clear crunching snow, slow and deliberate. Footsteps. I froze, listening intently. They stopped after a few seconds, and I convinced myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or a fox passing by. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning I stepped out onto the porch and noticed something strange. There were footprints in the snow, circling the cabin. They were human, not animal, and far too large to be my own. They led from the edge of the woods to the porch, and then back into the trees. I told myself it was probably a hiker or someone from another cabin nearby, though I hadn't seen any signs of other people since arriving. The thought of someone walking around while I slept sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off. That evening, as I was chopping wood outside, I got the distinct feeling I was being watched. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. When I went back inside, I locked the door and checked the windows twice. For the first time, I wished I wasn't alone. Around midnight, the footsteps came back. This time they were louder and closer. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear through the silence. The steps circled the cabin again, pausing by the porch. I didn't dare look outside. The sound stopped after a while, but sleep was impossible. I stayed up until dawn, clutching the flashlight I'd found in the kitchen. The next morning, the footprints were back, deeper and more defined. Whoever it was had walked up to the front door and stood there for a while. The snow was disturbed as if they had turned in place before walking back into the woods. I decided I couldn't stay another night. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now felt dangerous. As I packed up my things, I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see someone lurking in the trees. I loaded my bags into the car and checked the cabin one last time to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. That's when I saw it. On the kitchen counter was a small wooden figure, carved in the shape of a person. It hadn't been there before. The surface was rough, like it had been whittled quickly, and the base was smeared with dirt. My hands shook as I grabbed it, turning it over. I didn't know who had left it there or why, but I didn't stick around to find out. I tossed it outside, locked the cabin, and drove away as fast as the icy roads would allow. I kept checking my rear-view mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. Thankfully, I made it home without incident. I reported the footprints and the figure to the rental company, but they didn't have any answers. The cabin was cleaned and inspected after each guest, and the nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there with me. But every now and then I think about that figure, sitting on the counter as if it was waiting for me to find it. The thought still gives me chills. I haven't gone back to the mountains since. The peace and quiet that once seemed so inviting now feels like an open invitation for things best left unseen. There was 2 winters ago, I signed up to help with a Christmas charity drive in a small, snow-covered town about 3 hours from where I lived. The event was a last-minute decision, spurred by a combination of holiday guilt and a desire to do something meaningful. They needed volunteers to deliver food and gifts to remote families, so I figured I'd lend a hand. The area was breathtakingly beautiful, with winding roads that cut through dense pine forests and fields blanketed in snow. I was assigned a delivery route that stretched into the outskirts of town, with a few stops along the way. My car was packed with carefully wrapped gifts and boxes of canned goods. By mid-afternoon, the snow started falling heavily, and the roads turned slick. My GPS signal became unreliable, but I had a printed map as a backup. The houses I visited were humble but welcoming, and each family was grateful for the delivery. Despite the worsening weather, I felt good about what I was doing. As the sun began to set, I realized I had one last stop left. It was an old farmhouse located at the end of a narrow road that cut through the woods. The map marked it clearly, but the place felt isolated even on paper. I hesitated but decided to press on. After all, I couldn't just skip the delivery. The road leading to the farmhouse was treacherous. Snow piled up quickly, and the forest closed in around me, the trees leaning like silent spectators. The deeper I drove, the more uneasy I felt, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. When I finally reached the farmhouse, it was nearly dark. The house was weathered and leaning slightly to one side, with a broken porch railing and curtains drawn tightly over the windows. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney, the only sign of life. I grabbed the box marked for this address and made my way to the door. My boots crunched loudly in the snow, the sound almost startling in the stillness. Knocking on the door, I waited for a moment, then knocked again. Eventually the door opened a crack, and a man peeked out. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with unkempt hair and a face weathered by years of hard living. He didn't smile or say anything, just looked at me like he was sizing me up. I explained why I was there and handed him the box. He took it without a word and glanced over my shoulder, his eyes scanning the area behind me. It felt like he was expecting someone or something else. Before I could say anything else, he muttered a thank you and shut the door. I stood there for a second, feeling unsettled, but chalked it up to him being reserved or shy. As I walked back to my car, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading from the woods to the side of the house. They weren't mine, and they didn't match the older man's either. These were larger, heavier, and the stride was uneven, like whoever made them had a limp. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe someone else had been there earlier, but the thought didn't sit right. The snow was falling harder now, and the light was fading fast. I decided to head back to town before the weather got any worse. My car skidded a little as I turned around, but I managed to get back onto the narrow road. That's when I saw him. Standing in the middle of the road, about 50 feet ahead, was a figure. He, or it was tall and broad, dressed in dark clothing with a hood pulled up. He stood perfectly still, facing my car, as if he was waiting for me to approach. My heart started racing. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move, didn't wave or call out. I considered backing up, but the road was too narrow, and the snow was piling up fast. I decided to inch forward slowly, hoping the person would step aside, but as I got closer, they turned and walked into the woods. Their gait was strange, almost mechanical, and they disappeared into the trees without leaving a single sound. When I passed the spot where they had been standing, I glanced into the woods but saw nothing. No movement, no tracks, just an expanse of white. The rest of the drive back was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. When I finally reached the edge of town, I pulled over at a gas station to catch my breath. The clerk inside asked if I was okay, mentioning that I looked pale. I told him about the figure in the woods, and his expression darkened. He said something about how people shouldn't be wandering out there alone, especially near the old farmhouse. When I pressed him for more details, he shrugged and said the place had a reputation for attracting strangers. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't want to know. The next day, I told the charity organizer about my experience, and she apologized for sending me to such a remote spot. She said they hadn't delivered to that house in years, as the family who used to live there had moved away. When I asked about the older man who took the box, she looked confused. I never found out who I really delivered that package to, or who or what was watching me from the woods. But every time I see snow falling, I'm reminded of those footprints, the silent figure, and the unsettling feeling that something out there didn't want me to leave. There was something. A few years ago, I decided to take a solo trip to a small cabin in the mountains for a peaceful holiday getaway. I thought it would be the perfect way to escape the usual holiday chaos and recharge. The cabin was nestled in a remote area, surrounded by snow-covered pine trees, with no neighbors for miles, It seemed like the ideal spot to relax and disconnect from everything. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. The temperature had already dropped, and the first snowfall of the season had started to blanket the area in a soft, quiet layer of white. The cabin was exactly as the pictures online had shown, cozy, with a rustic charm, complete with a wood-burning stove and a small kitchen. There was no phone signal, which I thought was a blessing, and the only noise I could hear was the wind blowing through the trees. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the stove. The warmth quickly spread through the cabin, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. It had been months since I had the chance to get away like this, and I was ready for some much-needed solitude. The evening passed without incident. I made a simple dinner, read a book by the fire, and went to bed early, feeling content. The only light in the room came from the fire's embers, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The next morning I woke up to a thick blanket of snow covering the ground outside. The world was completely still, almost unnaturally so. I brewed a cup of coffee and settled into a chair by the window, watching the snowflakes fall. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the silence. No birds, no animals, not even the wind, just an eerie stillness. I decided to go for a walk through the woods behind the cabin. It was cold, but the fresh air felt invigorating. I bundled up, strapped on my boots, and headed out. The snow crunched underfoot as I made my way deeper into the forest, the trees standing tall and heavy with snow. It was peaceful, almost like I was the only person in the world. After about an hour, I decided to turn back. But when I reached the clearing where the cabin should have been, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the snow, were fresh footprints leading away from the cabin, deep and wide, as though someone had been walking around while I was inside. But I hadn't seen anyone when I went out. I was certain I had been alone. I froze, unsure of what to do. The footprints didn't look like animal tracks, they were too large and too deliberate. It was as though someone had been circling the cabin while I wasn't looking. I cautiously walked back toward the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. The footprints led to the back of the house, where there was a small porch. The snow was undisturbed there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I quickly went inside, locked the door, and checked all the windows. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unsettling feeling lingered. The rest of the day passed slowly. I tried to shake off my unease, telling myself that it was probably just an animal or perhaps someone else staying in a nearby cabin. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every time I glanced out the window, I felt like there was someone out there, just beyond my line of sight. That evening, as I sat down to eat, I heard something strange. A soft thud against the side of the cabin, followed by the sound of something scraping along the wooden walls. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, my hands shaking, and crept to the window. I couldn't see anyone, but the scraping noise continued, almost rhythmic, like someone was running their fingers along the cabin's exterior. I grabbed my phone, even though there was no signal, and tried to call anyone, but the screen just flashed, showing no bars. I didn't feel safe, not anymore. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, just in case, and checked all the locks once more. I decided to leave the cabin early the next morning, but when I went outside to pack up my car, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, just inches from my car, was a small, hand-carved wooden figure. It was a figure of a man, intricately detailed, but the face was blank, as if it had been left unfinished. The figure was cold to the touch, and there were small scratches on the back, as if it had been carved recently. I stood there staring at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Who would leave something like this? The woods were empty, no one had come near my cabin since I arrived, as far as I could tell. But somehow, this figure had appeared out of nowhere. I packed my things quickly, barely taking the time to make sure I didn't leave anything behind. The snow had started falling harder, and visibility was poor, but I wasn't staying another night. I didn't care about the isolation or the beauty of the mountains anymore. All I cared about was getting away from the cabin. As I drove down the winding road, the snowstorm intensified, and I found it harder to see the road ahead. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of white. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled into a gas station to catch my breath. My hands were still trembling from the events of the past 2 days. I told the attendant about the strange experience at the cabin, but he just shrugged it off, as if it was a normal occurrence in the area. He mentioned that sometimes people come up there looking for isolation, but they're not always who they seem. He didn't elaborate further, but the look in his eyes told me he knew more than he was letting on. I left the gas station without asking any more questions, and I didn't return to that cabin again. The figure, the scraping sound, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after I left. To this day, I can't help but wonder if someone was silently watching me from the woods, or if something more sinister had been lurking just beyond my sight. There was something.